Hi, hi Nancy, how are you?
I'm great. Well, thank you so much for coming on to my channel and sharing your advice. You have a very interesting background. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting that you do all these things. It's very inspiring as well, what you do. So, a little bit of background about myself. I've been a product manager for close to 10 years, very recently with Prime Video and Amazon Studios. And I started my career as a QA engineer before transitioning into product management. And I've worked across different industries, spent a bulk of my time in fintech. And then I transitioned over to like working for larger tech companies like Adobe and Amazon. I came to the US in 2006 to pursue my master's in electrical engineering. Also ended up getting an MBA degree from University of Chicago as while I was working at Morningstar.
Wow. I also love if you could share how you transition from QA to product, because a lot of people are wondering how to go about transitioning.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So the transition from QA to product happened when I was working at Morningstar. So I joined Morningstar back in 2012, started out as a QA engineer with them. Quite honestly, I didn't know much about product management until that time because all the companies that I was working before were either in the electrical utility industry, or they were like pure research and development and didn't have the concept of product management
Uh,
specifically. So it was when I joined Morningstar, I got first introduced to the world of product management. What really interested me at that time was the concept of hopping on calls with clients, demoing the products, and understanding what exactly that the customers wanted and how do you go about like utilizing the base products that you have, but building out additional features or additional functionalities, or how do you meet the gaps between your product and what the customers wanted? What are the customer needs? I
were you
think
doing
that
that when you were in QA?
I wasn't. I worked very closely with the product managers in my team,
Okay.
which was when I felt like, oh, I this is something that I think I'll really enjoy. This is
Yeah.
something that I want to do. I want to get on calls with clients. I want to understand what their pain points are, and I want to come up with like solutions. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when I threw my hat in the ring. I went to my manager, who was luckily for me, my manager oversaw both QA and product managers. So I said, this is something that I want to be. I want to get an opportunity to be a product manager.
Right.
And it was not a easy and straightforward transition. They said they were willing to bet on me because I'd performed well as a QA until that time. They were willing to bet on me, but I had to try to balance both the roles at the same time, which I did for about a year. And then when they thought that I could make a significant impact in my role as a product manager, that was when I completely transitioned into product management.
That resonates so much with me because it reminds me of my own journey. So, how long were you in QA before talking to your manager about the transition?
I was in QA for about, I'd say, 1 year. I'm really grateful for my former manager, who's also my mentor, for believing in me, for giving me that opportunity. Because I joined as a QA engineer and got promoted to a senior QA engineer within like
Uh,
6 months of being in the company.
that is amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing. So, if I were to summarize your story, don't be afraid to ask for what you want.
Exactly.
The caveat is, though, you have to be doing a good job.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
People need to believe in you first. And
Yeah.
oftentimes that first step is dependent on someone else believing in you.
Exactly.
Right.
You need to have a, how do I put this? You need to have someone who can vouch for you, someone who can believe in you. And for them to believe in you, you have to gain that trust. And the
Totally.
way you gain that trust is like showing them or
Yes.
proving them that you are qualified enough to do what they want you to do.
And you were doing both the QA job and the PM job in parallel at the same time for about a year.
Yeah, for about a year before I felt I was ready, and they also agreed that I
Right.
was ready, and we decided like, okay, let's do the transition.
I had a similar experience. I started in engineering and I really believed that I would like the PM job more and that I would be a better PM than an engineer. And then I asked the PM manager, can you give me a chance? This was after a few years at the company. And then they said, well, as an engineer, you're working on one module at a time. And so your focus area is very specific to that one module. But as a PM, you need to think end to end.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, yeah, I could do that. I had no idea what that even meant. Right.
True.
But I just said, oh, yeah, I can totally do that. And then they said, why don't you try QA first? Because QA needs to test end to end.
End to end.
And I was like, yes, I could do that. So I actually did QA work for a while before they agreed to let me write my first PRD. And this was on top of my engineering job. Yeah, so I also had to do multiple jobs at the same time in parallel. I need to prove myself to the people who had the power to give me what I wanted, but I also wanted to prove to me, to myself. Like I wanted to know if I could really do the job and if I would like it. And it turned out that I did really enjoy this extra job, this second and third job. Then I just kept on going. And then eventually I got the title change.
Yep. And you hit the nail right on the head when you said like QA job is end to end, testing end to end, and which makes it like, a very, I wouldn't necessarily seamless transition, but there are a lot of parallels in it.
Yes.
And the best part of QA job, a lot of people assume, oh, you're given a bunch of test cases and you create test cases based on whatever the product requirements are, and you go about testing those. But a lot of people fail to notice or realize with QA, you have the flexibility to be creative, because when you see a particular behavior, you can put yourself as in the user's shoe. This doesn't make sense. Like, why can't it be so easy? Or why do we need to go through so many clicks? Or why can't we reduce the clicks?
Yes, because you are the user when you're doing those tests. And that's where the empathy really forms. And so originally, I didn't understand why they would force me to do QA first, but now looking back, it makes total sense.
True.
Okay, you also have some very interesting stories about navigating the economy in turbulent times. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've been working since 2009. So this has been 14 years of professional career. And in this 14 years of professional career, I've lost my job twice. One in 2020, right when the pandemic started. And the other one was 2008, as it was getting ready to graduate, defending my master's thesis. I had a job offer in hand from one of the automotive companies here in the Midwest. But 2008, the crisis hit different industries very hard, and automotive was one of the industries. So I received the call one fine morning saying that, hey, we'd like to present your offer letter. And I was, as a new grad student in this country, I was devastated. It was hard for me to process it. It was hard for me. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? But more than that, what was hard for me is it applied for my OPT, or like optional practical training, which meant that I have to find a job in the next 90 days. I was time constrained. I was time bound. Which was, I think, end of the day, going back to my home country was okay. It was not a problem. But I think I didn't want to go without getting my master's degree, which was going to take another 6 to 9 months for me to like wind up my master's thesis, defend my thesis, and graduate. And it felt like I came here for a reason, and I have to go back without that reason, right? And so I ended up applying for all kinds of roles. And the reason why I start with the 2008 is because I specifically want to highlight the don'ts of this process, especially to the new grads, right? It was mindless applying, like going, and at that time, I don't think like LinkedIn was that popular, even though it's been around for like 20 odd years. It wasn't that popular. That time it was mostly Indeed and Monster.com and Career Builder and all those, right?
Right,
And so
right.
I applied for all of those, and then I reached out to family. I didn't reach out to friends. I reached out to family asking them to help. But again, these are folks who've been in the country for 20 to 30 years, and they were
Uh-huh.
slightly out of touch with the needs of what a fresh graduate would be. They had a different perspective and everything. And that's how I ended up finding a contract gig in an electrical utility company as a QA engineer. And I was also being very insistent that I look for jobs only in the electrical industry because that's what my master's degree was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I ended up being a QA engineer, which in short was accidental. It was not intentional.
Mm-hmm.
But reflecting back on that, things that I would encourage new grads to be mindful of or not to repeat the same mistakes that I did. Don't go about applying mindlessly because it's just going to put you in a pile of candidates
Yeah.
and it won't set you apart.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest thing that I've learned over the years, and I think my B school degree has prepared me well for this, is like the concept of networking and how important it is to your job search. Talk to people, network, reach out to connections. Now LinkedIn is there, you have a subscription. I know it's a little bit expensive, but it's something worth investing in for the next few months. Find out roles there, find out who the hiring manager is there, or find out if you can talk to people, send out emails, talk to people, build those connections and see where that takes you. The second thing is, when you build the connections, don't right away ask them for the job. Talk about your experience, talk about what that company is looking for, what that specific team or what they expect out of a person in that role. You can showcase, hey, I'm qualified for this role because I bring in XYZ skill sets.
Mm-hmm.
So be very thoughtful and very prudent about how you approach these conversations because it's important to build a network and build a connection instead of like directly going and saying, hey, can you actually refer me to this role? I think I'd be a great fit for this role. Because that doesn't add any value. You need to have those conversations in order for them to believe and trust in you.
Right. And how did you navigate the situation the second time?
The second time, it was much better. So I had built a network, and I also was part of a product management group or circle, which had a lot of product managers. I reached out to a bunch of people saying that, like, hey, I ended up losing my job. I want to look for my next gig. This is what I've done in the past. These are the skill sets that I bring in. And like, would love to have conversations with any of you if you see any open roles in your company. You don't have to refer me right away, but would love to set up those introductory conversations, would love to have those kind of conversations. So that's one thing that I did. Reached out to my former managers slash mentors who really vouched for me, who set up introductions within their own company. And above all, my wife has been a big guiding support as part of this process. She made a ton of referrals to her colleagues, ex-colleagues, and setting up introductions. I wouldn't say that all of these would directly convert into like fetching me an interview. It started out with those initial conversations, right? Think about this as like a sales pitch. So you have to sell yourself. You have to think of yourself as the product that you want to sell. Your resume is the product that you want to sell. And how would you sell yourself?
So mindset wise, though, going into this process, we need to have the mindset to know that, okay, this is not going to be like a quick thing.
Yep.
This is going to take time.
Yeah.
So we need to pace ourselves too, and don't just go all in 20 hours a day kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
Because the effort, like you said, it might not convert right away, but there's a snowball effect.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to, keep on working at it day after day. And because it's going to take time.
Yeah. Yeah.
You also go ahead.
And you need to take a break as well, right? A lot of people probably, when you end up losing job, they go right into interviewing mode and applying mode very next day. I think it's important from a mental health and awareness perspective, it's important to take a break. The second time around, what I did was I actually went to India with my kid. My kid was 2 years old. I went to India. I spent time with my family. My grandparents got to see my kid. And like after 1 month of completely relaxing and everything, then I came back. I started getting into that interview mode and interview mindset. But I also realized, like, people have different constraints and different restrictions, which is very evident from my case, right? Like 2008 versus 2020. What was different? 2008, I was a grad student with like 90 days left to find a job. 2020, yes, I'm still on a visa. I still have like 60 days left to find a job. But I also figured, like, worst thing, what would happen? I would not find a job. I could probably go as a dependent on my wife, dependent on her visa, or I think I've saved enough that I can even go back home. I think the mindset different, and it's easier said than done, right? Like 2008, my mindset was different. 2020, my mindset was different. Especially for new grads, if or for people on these visa constraints, if you have that visa constraints, I understand your clock starts ticking. We say 60 days, but it's like truly 45 days because you need to go through some process and everything. But at least take a couple of days to recuperate from whatever has happened to you, because that will help you do better in the interviews. Because if you start going at it right away, end of 4 or 5, you might do well in the first 2 3 interviews, but end of 4 or 5 days, you'd be burned out.
And now let's transition into the art of interviewing, right? I feel again the mindset component is very important. When we are interviewing, there's an energy exchange. And so when you're not your best self, then the energy you give off is not going to be the best energy that you could give off, right? And a lot of these interviews are dependent on how the interviewer feels about you. So you definitely want to feel your best so that you can be your best in these interview settings. So talk to us about your advice when we approach behavioral interviews.
Yeah, great question, right? Like, and I'll tell you about my own experience with Amazon. And this was back in like, Feb 2020. It was in-person interviews. I flew down to Seattle going for in-person interviews, 5 back-to-back interviews. The first one went well. Second one was disastrous. And the key here to remember is it's okay for 1 or 2 interviews to go bad, but don't let it affect your other interviews. It's important for you to pick yourself up and go and do well. One thing that I did after the second interview went bad was like the third interview started immediately. I actually asked the interviewer, like, hey, you know what? I didn't do that great in this interview. I want to take like a 5-minute break. I want to go grab some coffee. I want to wash my face. I want to come back a little bit refreshed. It's completely okay to ask that. The worst thing that they can say is no. And I don't think and if they say no, it also tells you about the culture of the company. So I did that, and they were kind enough to offer that to me. I went, grabbed coffee, I washed my face. I said, okay, you know what? This is a new interview. The positive affirmations are needed, and that's truly needed. Like, tell them, don't think about like the bad things that have, and I used to be that. I used to think about like all the bad things that have happened to me, and I used to go into that negative spiral mindset. But think about, I had a product coach who taught me to think about like how far I have come instead of like what all happened to me. So think about how far you have come, what all you have achieved. Use that to convert into like positive affirmations and positive energy, and that will translate into like you doing well, even if the interviewer sends out like doesn't send out like great vibes. As long as you maintain your calm and composure and you have those positive vibes, you'll be able to do really well in these interviews.
I love that. Turning something that you didn't think was very positive into something more positive. One tip that has worked for me is like you said, you want to think about how far you've come and you want to anchor your thoughts on facts. Now, how far you have come, that is a fact,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
don't want to anchor on, ooh, what if? Oh,
Yeah,
that didn't go well. Oh, like how does that person feel about me? They must think, like the worst. You don't know that. That's not a
exactly.
fact, right?
Yeah,
It might feel very true, but we want to analyze the situation first. Is that a fact? Like who
yeah,
who says that's true? No one can say that's true, right? So
exactly.
pull ourselves out of that spiral and just focus on what you know is true. And that
Yeah.
I thought was very helpful when I was kind of learning about how to deal with all kinds of different emotions.
Yeah, and also not to think about like the result, right? I think I learned this from my wife. Like whenever I used to think a lot about, like, I had one of my friend tell me, "Oh, you go down 5 years down in the future, you create an imaginary problem, you bring that problem back to the
Uh,
present, and you start stressing over it."
yeah,
But my wife, on the other hand, she's like, okay, it's 5 years down the future. We'll visit that when it comes to that.
yeah,
The same thing applies for interviews, right? Like the results of the interviews, you've done your best. The results of the interviews are not in your control.
yeah.
So if you start thinking about the results, you might end up not doing well in the interviews. So
Yes.
don't think about the results. Think about like how well you can do in the present, and let the future play out itself.
Yes. So, what tactical tips do you have for us when we approach behavioral interviews?
So tactical tips, a few things that I'd say is like, star format is again known for everyone. Everyone knows about it. Like everyone knows about like how Amazon behavioral interviews work. And like, that's like a guiding stone for like all the behavioral interviews. But couple of things that I'd say is like, a lot of people say like, oh, my answers are long. I don't know how to condense it. If you
Mm,
don't know how to condense it, make the conversational interactive. So take deliberate pauses. Ask them like, oh, okay, you know what? Does this make sense, or do you want me to clarify anything? Like I used to talk a lot about like one of my previous companies which was in the immigration space,
mm,
and a lot of people don't understand immigration space as much. So I used to take deliberate pauses. I'd say, hey, this is a very niche space. Like, I'm does it make sense? I'm happy to like take a pause and like help address the question. And from there, a lot of those conversations went very interactive instead of like sticking to the star format and going that like situation, task, action, and result. It
yes.
helped me put at ease and like do best in those interviews. So
Yes.
that is one thing I'd say. Second thing I would say is like, ask for time before starting to give out your answers. A lot of people make this mistake, like they think like the silence is very awkward. It's okay to have those awkward silences. Say that you want 30 seconds or 45 seconds or a minute, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Tell them that I want to jot down my thoughts before I start talking about
Yeah.
it. Ask for the time and then start talking about whatever you want to talk about.
Right.
The last thing I'd say is like, we are in this very different economy where like it's very hard to predict whether we'll have a job the next day or not. So
Right.
whatever work you're doing, make sure you're actually documenting it,
Mm,
and so that you can, so if the worst happens, you have all your inputs, like you have your metrics, you have like things that you did and everything, for you to immediately create a story for the behavioral interviews.
yes, I love that. Also, taking a pause, like you said, before jumping in makes the conversation feel more natural too.
Yeah,
Imagine if you're just talking to a friend, you're not just jumping in and start
exactly.
like applying star everywhere, right? That's
Yeah.
not natural. And it goes back to the point we had earlier is you want to display this energy that is genuine because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, how they feel about you is basically they're picturing what it's like to work with you,
Exactly. That's a
right?
good
And
point.
if you're coming across mechanical or robotic,
Yeah,
they would feel differently.
true.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Balaji. That was such an insightful chat.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thanks for having me here.
We'll chat soon.
Yeah, chat soon. All right. Bye-bye.